Well, good morning. I had to come into Oxford today to go to a bookshop to buy a couple of books I want, and so I thought I would give another in my occasional series of rambling on. So, I am here standing in the middle of Broad Street in the centre of Oxford. Well, technically, the building's on my left here. The back wall of these buildings is actually the old city wall from the medieval city, so technically I'm standing outside the city of Oxford, centre of the city of Oxford, but in the modern city this is very much a city centre street on the north side of the city. So I just want to talk about a few important bits of this street's history. Probably the most significant, certainly the most infamous part of Broad Street's history is the location. I'll just turn the camera around. In the centre of the road there is marked a cross, and this cross is the location of the pyre upon which Bishops Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer, and then later Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, were executed by burning. The execution took place outside Balliol College, which is the building behind me here, and was an interesting episode in English history, particularly English history. This is pre the Act of Union, pre the union of the two crowns in James VI and First. So 1553, Edward VI dies. Edward VI had been a avowedly Protestant king and had significantly reformed the English church and religion to do away with all superstitious popish practices. So the three leading bishops of the English church at the time were Nicholas Ridley, Hugh Latimer and Thomas Cranmer, and they were obviously very significant in the court of Edward VI and were leading councillors of state. It was these three, together with Edward, who plotted to prevent Mary Tudor from becoming queen by putting their cousin, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne instead. As a result of the plotting, all three bishops were arrested for treason, but because Mary's... well, this is where it all gets a little bit more complicated. Mary Tudor was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was the first wife of Henry VIII and was able to marry Henry despite having been married to Henry's older brother Arthur, because the Pope of the day gave a dispensation permitting the marriage on the basis that Catherine had not actually consummated her marriage with Arthur before Arthur's untimely death. By the 1530s, Mary was the only healthy child born of this union between Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, and so Henry, in the King's Great Matter, had Catherine put aside in favour of Anne Boleyn. Now, there is a famous rhyme which goes, "Divorced, beheaded, she died, divorced, beheaded, survived," which is the usual way of describing the fates of the 6 queens of Henry VIII. Technically, however, Henry didn't divorce Catherine of Aragon. He had the marriage declared null and void on the basis that the Pope had no authority in religion to dispense Catherine from her marriage to Arthur. In effect, this made Catherine of Aragon a slut and a fornicator, because she had married and slept with a man to whom she was not married and had lied about her relationship with Prince Arthur, and it also had the effect, of course, of making Mary Tudor a bastard. And the churchman who had enabled Henry's so-called divorce was Thomas Cranmer, along with Thomas Cromwell, who was the replacement of Thomas More as Chancellor of England. So with Mary Tudor, it was personal. So not only had Cranmer attempted to subvert Mary's legitimate claim to the throne through denying the legitimate marriage of her mother, he then also tried to put an imposter Lady Jane Grey on the throne instead of Mary. So it was double treason. But equally important for Mary was her Catholic faith. And so in October 1554, the trials of Cranmer, Latimer and Ridley were opened, and Cranmer's case was reserved to Rome because he was an archbishop. Latimer and Ridley were very quickly found guilty of heresy and treason and were burned on the spot in October 1554, and Thomas Cranmer was brought to witness their execution. In the intervening months between October 1554 and March 1555, Thomas Cranmer was found guilty by a court in Rome and was deposed from his archbishopric and handed over to the secular authorities, being Queen Mary, for punishments by the crown. During this period, clearly the thought of such a horrific death preying heavily on his mind, Cranmer recanted his Lutheranism and Protestant reforming zeal. He submitted to papal authority. He repented of all his sins and was absolved. And in canon law, in force at the time, this should have been sufficient for him to have been reprieved from burning, and it should have been a commuted sentence, possibly still executed as a traitor, but that would have been by beheading rather than burning at the stake, which I suppose if death is the only option, you want the more straightforward, simplest one, if possible. So I'm just walking around the corner into Magdalen Street here. There's a lot of confusion in Oxford because the college named after St Mary Magdalene is known by the Old English pronunciation of Magdalen. But St Mary Magdalene's Church, which is here on my left-hand side behind this bus, St Mary Magdalene's Church there, the road Magdalen Street is named after St Mary Magdalene's Church, and that pronunciation is Magdalen. So what makes it more confusing still is that in Iffley, there on the Iffley Road, there is a road owned by Magdalen College, which is called Magdalen Road. So we have St Mary Magdalene's Church on Magdalen Street and Magdalen College with Magdalen Bridge and Magdalen Road just down the road from it. So it's a source of constant confusion in Oxford. I'm just going to cross over the road. So by one of the interesting, so I was talking about Thomas Cranmer, and he repented of his Protestant reform, but because of all the reasons I've already mentioned to do with the personal history of Mary Tudor and Catherine of Aragon, she was not going to be assuaged by his apparent repentance, and so the sentence of burning still stood. The day before his execution, Cranmer was invited to preach from the pulpit of the University Church of St Mary the Virgin in the High Street in order to publicly recant his heresy. He had written out the public recantation and it had been approved for his use, but during his opportunity in the pulpit he recanted his recantation and promised that he would burn his right hand first for having signed the original recantations. He was naturally dragged from the pulpit and taken back to prison to await execution. On the very same day, Cardinal Poole, who, despite not being a clergyman, was a cardinal of the Roman Church, his mother, Margaret Poole of Countess of Salisbury, had been executed by Henry VIII as a traitor, and who had potentially a stronger claim to the throne than even the Tudors, as the grandson of Edward IV, who was the last of the Plantagenet kings. Well, no, I'm sorry, Richard III was the last of the Plantagenets, but Edward IV was the last of the legitimate Plantagenet kings, given that Richard III murdered Edward V in the Tower, the two princes in the Tower. Sorry, lots of confusing English history there, but the important thing was that Cardinal Poole was ordained a priest and a bishop the day before Cranmer's execution as Archbishop was carried out. Now, obviously Mary dies in 1558, as does Cardinal Poole, on the very same day, in fact, in 1558, in November. Elizabeth I becomes Queen. England becomes the kind of mishmash compromise Anglo-Protestant, Catholic-Protestant Anglican settlement, which is fairly, I mean, Episcopalian. It has all the trappings of Catholicism without the rather difficult bits of purgatory, transubstantiation, and the Pope, I guess. And England settles down into the Protestant realm that it remains today through the Act of Settlement in 1702, I think. Anyway, which the Act of Settlement was introduced during Queen Anne's reign because Queen Anne was going to die childless, and the next 50 people in line to the throne were all Catholics. And the Protestant English did not want a Catholic monarch, and so the Act of Settlement required the next monarch and all future monarchs of England to be Protestant and to not marry a Catholic, which has pretty much been the case. And that's how the Hanoverians became rulers of England in the 1720s. But that's a long way ahead at this point. Actually, it's a long way behind of where we're going now. So England becomes a settled Protestant Reformed church, and by the beginning of the 19th century there was a feeling that the Anglican Church had kind of lost its way. It had become just a gentleman's club for the wealthy, that there was corruption, purchasing of benefices, a laxity of faith, a laxity of spirituality. And so there were a number of different movements that sprang up in the Anglican Church at this time, and the most significant perhaps was the Oxford movement, which was a group of the University of Oxford at that time was still broadly a seminary university where people came to study their theology before they were ordained. And there was a group of young men, John Keble, John Henry Newman, to name Cardinal Wiseman, to name but three of them, who had been at the university and had formed what's known as the Oxford movement, which was an attempt to return to the first fervours of faith and practice of the early Christian church. And this is always attempting, I mean, this is in many ways the whole of the English or the European Reformation in the first place. There was a desire to do precisely this kind of thing. But in many ways it alarmed a lot of Anglican Protestants because it seemed to be dabbling in the superstitious practices of popery once more. And indeed eventually Nicholas Wiseman and John Henry Newman both independently become Catholics and both independently become cardinals. But as a kind of reaction to the Oxford movement, the monument that you can see behind me was purchased by public subscription. And this is the Martyrs Memorial, and around the top you'll see that there are figures, and there's two others. Those are the figures of Nicholas Ridley, Hugh Latimer and Thomas Cranmer. And around the bottom is an inscription about who they were and what they said and why they died. In particular is recorded the fact that when Cranmer was eventually tied up and set alight on the pyre of his execution, he did indeed put his right hand into the heart of the flames to be consumed first in order to recant his recantations. I will just go back round now into Broad Street and I will carry on in a moment. Well, I'm back in Broad Street now. Broad Street is a semi-pedestrianised road. It has on-street parking, but it's not a road that leads anywhere at the moment due to the traffic management systems in the city. On this side of the road behind me, So as you look away from towards the east on the northern side of Broad Street are two of the Oxford colleges. Oxford University is a collegiate university, which means that although there is a university administration and charters and all the rest of it, students are enrolled into the university via the colleges. And so you're never just a member of the university, you're a member of Balliol College, Oxford University. There are other collegiate universities around England, London and Manchester being two of them, and I believe places like Princeton and Harvard are also semi-collegiate. Certainly the University of California is a collegiate university as well. So the college down to this end is Balliol College. Sorry, someone seemed to be reversing straight at me then. So the college at the far end of the street is Balliol College, and this college behind me here is Trinity College. Both of them have a pre-Reformation origin. Trinity College was refounded and renamed Trinity College after the Reformation, but before the Reformation was actually the Durham College. It was the house of study for the monks of Durham Cathedral, which was a cathedral priory and had a monastery attached to it. Sir John de Balliol, who founded Balliol College, did so as a debt of a means of settling a debt to the Bishop of Durham, and was established for lay people who would work within the cathedral administration and that kind of thing. So both of these colleges, in a sense, are the same entity, which is a foundation of Durham. Sir John de Balliol was famous for the fact that his son and grandson became kings of Scotland during the disputed period of Scottish kingship in the 13th century. So moving further along Broad Street, and we're getting now to the reason I came to Oxford in the first place. Behind me you can see a shop called Blackwell's Art and Poster Shop. On the left hand side, just ahead, is the main Blackwell shop, which I will talk about very shortly, but I want to go to the far end of Broad Street now. There is another college on my right hand side, and I believe I think this one is Exeter College, which actually its front doors are on Turl Street, opposite Jesus College. I can never remember which way round it is. I know one of them is Jesus and one of them is Exeter, but I just can't remember which is which. And one of the things you will have noticed is that the buildings on this side are quite dark. That's just staining from smoke from when Oxford was an industrial town. There's been a lot of restoration work taken place, and I think you can see there is scaffolding around various parts of the buildings, and there's a lot of cleaning going on so that the Cotswold stone is beginning to glow this golden yellow, which is its natural state, and it is making everything look really very cheerful and bright. So now I'm actually standing outside the Sheldonian Theatre, which is not the one behind me, is this building here. You'll notice yes, you can see the cupola at the top. That's an 8-sided cupola, and the Sheldonian Theatre was built in the period immediately after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660s, and was designed by Sir Christopher Wren, who was obviously responsible for a lot of the rebuilding work that happened in London after the Great Fire in the 1660s. And this theatre was deliberately designed to look like an old Roman theatre, including the 8-sided cupola on top, and around the perimeter on the tops of the pillars are busts of various Roman emperors, including Constantine the Great and various others. The Sheldonian Theatre was built as much to house the ceremonies of the university, so matriculation and degree ceremonies and graduations all happen within the Sheldonian Theatre. And it is named after the then Chancellor of the university, who was Archbishop of Canterbury, Gilbert Sheldon, who paid the £14,000 that it cost over a period of time to build this building, which back in the 17th century, £14,000 is roughly the equivalent of around £2 million now. So it was a hefty donation that he made, and only in 2015 did they actually have their first dramatic theatre production. It is primarily used either for university ceremonies or for musical performances by the various chamber orchestras and the like that are associated with the university. On my right hand side, so behind me, is the Bodleian Library. This is the old Bodleian. I will talk a lot more about the Bodleian, but I'll just mention that it's here. And on my left hand side is the Duke Humphrey Library, and I think, if I'm right, if I walk around this side of the Duke Humphrey, yes, there we are. That is actually on the side of the building, up above my head, a statue of Duke Humphrey. The Bodleian Library is a copyright library in the UK, and so every publication in the UK sends 6 copies of that publication to this library for it to store as a copyright, but also for use in academic research. It's one of the only library in Britain that's bigger than this library is the British Library in London, which is also a copyright library. And because it was founded when Ireland was part of the UK, the Bodleian Library also has the legal right to request copies of any books published in the Irish Republic as well, which I think generally they do, so it's quite a significant library. But the Duke Humphrey Library is an older part of the library. As you can tell, it's very much in the neoclassical style. If we walk around the corner into Cat Street, some of these roads may seem familiar to some of you who enjoy the Inspector Morse mysteries. It's always a source of amusement for people in Oxford to watch as Morse's car exits from a street which we know is pedestrianised and that there is no through road anywhere else, so where he's coming from and where he's going to is anybody's guess. But it's you may recognise a lot of these roads from that programme. And I'm just going to walk a little way into Cat Street to show you another part of the Bodleian Library and one other landmark which may be of interest. So if I stand and look this way, you can see behind me in this corner over here, that is the corner of the Radcliffe Camera, which is a rotunda building and which is also part of the University Library. And then the horizontal bit of building here, with some of the spires that you can see, is actually the University Church of St Mary the Virgin. So it's a significant location. But again, I will talk more about the Bodleian Library on a future video. And then behind me is Hertford College Bridge of Sighs. The Bridge of Sighs was named by Lord Byron in the 19th century and is a bridge which is named for a bridge which crosses from the Doge's Palace to the prison in Venice. And it was believed to be the Bridge of Sighs because prisoners who were going down to their summary executions or permanent imprisonment in the prison of the Doge would have their long last look over the beautiful city of Venice and sigh and never see it again. This is complete bunkum because the bridge was built after the prison had stopped being used for those purposes, and in fact this bridge is more akin to the Rialto Bridge in Venice rather than the Bridge of Sighs, but it's a nice idea. On either side of the road, this is New College Lane. On either side of the road is Hertford College, and so this is a skywalk between the two sides of the college without the students having to go outside the building. But in fact, there is a lot of mischievous talk that the students at Hertford were considered to be the most unfit in the university, and so they were banned from using the bridge and had to come outside and walk across and go back upstairs. In actual fact, if you want to use the bridge as the skywalk, you actually go up and down more stairs than if you come outside and go back in. So it is a purely apocryphal story. And you'll see on the corner of the building there a heart, after which Hertford College is named. We'll just carry on now and walk back into Broad Street. We've only got 2 more sites to see in this particular part of town. And the first one is facing the Duke Humphrey Library across the road, and is the new Bodleian Library, which again I will show you the river from behind me. It's very difficult to see because of the sunlight. It is incredibly cold here today, but a beautiful blue sky. We've actually been getting quite spring-like weather up until this week, with temperatures in the low 10s. But there has been a significant change in the last 2 days. There is a wind coming in from the east, from the steppes of Russia, and it is perishingly cold. It's barely getting above freezing even in the middle of the day. And we're due some snow possibly tomorrow and Monday as well. But it does make it a very nice day for wearing my crocheted scarf. So every cloud has a silver lining. So this is the new Bodleian Library, which, as I say, is across the road from the Duke Humphrey Library and the old Bodleian Library. It was actually designed in the 1930s by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott. And his intention, well, he was given a very strict brief that it was to be large enough to house the significantly larger library that the Bodleian had become, but wasn't allowed to be any taller than any of the buildings around the area. So the only way that Sir Giles could actually make this work was to go down. And so beneath our feet are what's known as the university stacks, and it's miles and miles of shelving. And in fact, you can walk from the old Bodleian Library all the way through to the Radcliffe Camera on the other side of from the new Bodleian Library, all the way underneath the Duke Humphrey Library and the old Bodleian Library through to the Radcliffe Camera without actually coming upstairs. So it's a massive undertaking. And Scott's intention was to build a Jacobean style house, so Palladian-esque, if you like. It didn't work. It's very much a product of its era. It's neither Knelt nor Summit, as Pevsner didn't quite put it, but kind of did. And it just fails to achieve, the proportions are wrong. It's very squat and brutal in its execution, and very much is reminiscent of the fascist style of architecture on the continent in the same period, in Italy and in the German Reich. It's a very brutal looking building. It's had a major refurbishment over the last 5 or so years on the inside, and the outside has been cleaned up, so the stone is looking at its best again. But it really, the inside has been totally revamped, and apparently is now a very good place to sit and study and read and access the troves of treasure of intellectual greatness that are housed within the library. But its exterior remains, I don't know, it's odd that Sir Giles, one of the greatest architects of his age, I suppose everyone's allowed to make a mistake, and this was definitely his. I really don't have any redeeming it doesn't have any redeeming qualities at all for me whatsoever, but there we go, that's just the way it is. And sometimes the mistakes are as important as the great beauties of art, so I wouldn't want to get rid of it either. So now I have come, and across the road, so between Trinity College and the new Bodleian Library, is the shop that I want to come to, which is the Blackwell's shop. Blackwell's is a publisher, and a bookshop rather. In its first instance, it is a bookshop, which was started in the 19th century, across the road from where I'm standing right now. In fact, I will turn the camera around. So Blackwell's was founded in the 19th century, at the very end of the century, as an academic bookshop within the university, as well as the Bodleian Library. All of the university colleges and all of the university departments have got their own libraries as well, but people will always want to have their own copy of a work. And so Blackwell's was founded to service the needs of the students in the university. It very quickly developed a publishing arm as well of academic and textbooks. And really until the 1990s was based here in Broad Street in Oxford and had its publishing, and that was it. But there was a significant push to expand its operations in the 1990s, which resulted in Blackwell's buying out a couple of other academic bookshop chains, and so now there are between 50 and 60 Blackwell shops at various university campuses around the UK. At the same time, Blackwell's also decided to pull out of the publishing game, and so technically, well, there was a second publishing house called Wiley's in Oxford, which also published textbooks, and technically the two merged and became Wiley Blackwell's, but in fact Wiley's bought out the publishing arm of Blackwell's, which led to a significant split in the family. This is still a family-owned business, and it did lead to significant issues for the family, but ultimately they were resolved. I'm going to go inside now, and I will show you some pictures of the Norrington room. Sir John Norrington was the president of Trinity College in the 1970s, and he gave permission for Blackwell's to expand downwards as the Bodleian Library had, and to build a subterranean room for selling books, which turned into the largest single room for selling books anywhere in the world, and is named after Sir John Norrington. He's named the Norrington Room, and I'll go downstairs and I will show you some pictures of that, and then I will finish off my little tour for you.